Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. I was just listening to Meat Loaf's album, Bat Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell, and I was thinking about what to say about it, and then I found a quotation by the man who wrote all the songs on the album, Jim Steinman, where he described his ambition of wanting to make a Godfather, that being Bat Out of Hell, and a Godfather II. So, does Bat Out of Hell Part 2, Back into Hell, hold up as the Godfather II of albums? For those who don't know, the Godfather Part 2, probably considered the most artistically successful sequel of all time. So, for starters, Jim Steinman was a songwriter like no other. So, on the one hand, he used the chord patterns of 50s and early 60s rock and roll, and he wrote about rock and roll, motorcycle, lover boy type characters. But his songs were also more than rock and roll. He saw himself as having classical influences, and as a result, his songs were long and epic, and they often had over-the-top, silly titles. In 1977, Jim Steinman writes all of the songs for an album he did in collaboration with his friend, the amazing singer Meat Loaf, and that, of course, became Bat Out of Hell. Steinman was instantly tempted to create his iconic sequel, but there were various issues in recording, including Meat Loaf losing his voice in the studio. Eventually, there was a fallout between Meat Loaf and Jim Steinman that manifested in various ways over the years. Jim Steinman did a solo album in 1981, despite not having the huge voice necessarily to sing his huge songs. He's a good singer. He's just not a Meat Loaf level singer. He wrote a song called Total Eclipse of the Heart that Meat Loaf wanted to sing, but it ended up going to Bonnie Tyler because he and Meat Loaf weren't getting along, and yada, yada, yada. Because of all this drama, the sequel that was supposed to come out, 2 years later, kind of like Godfather Part II, after The Godfather, ended up coming out 16 years later, 1993, the year of my birth. One might ask, Bat Out of Hell, it's an album of rock songs, rock albums. Some of them are loosely connected, but mostly they're just a collection of unrelated tunes. So can you really have a sequel to a rock album? Meat Loaf was apparently quoted as saying that they called this album Bat Out of Hell Part 2 because it would sell better than other Meat Loaf albums if they referenced his one big success. But Steinman, I think, was more insistent that this was a true sequel. I think that truth kind of plays out, especially if one listens to the album with the realization that it was recorded 16 years later. Meat Loaf recorded the first Bat Out of Hell when he was almost 30, but singing as characters who were even younger. And certainly today, especially to me, 30 doesn't seem that old anymore. But by the time he was recording Bat Out of Hell Part 2, he was middle-aged. He was 45. So as a result, you had Bat Out of Hell 1 being an album of youth and Bat Out of Hell being an album of more middle age. So think about it. With Bat Out of Hell 1, the youthfulness flies in its face. The title track, Bat Out of Hell, is about breaking out of a tiny town, roaring on a motorcycle. You took the words right out of my mouth. Is about making out in a car. Paradise by the Dashboard Light is about going all the way in a car. Paradise is also about a boy promising to love a girl forever so she can feel comfortable about going all the way. This being a song that's clearly set in the 1950s. Bat Out of Hell Part 2, by contrast, starts with a reversal of that assumption that only women want love. No, but Bat Out of Hell Part 2 starts with Meat Loaf's most famous song ever, I Would Do Anything for Love, but I Won't Do That. And the sweet sincerity of this song is made more apparent by how it is often misunderstood. The title sounds like a joke. I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. So many people hear it as saying, I would do anything for love. I'm really bragging, but actually you wouldn't do anything for love. But if you actually look at the lyrics in context, what it really means is I would do anything for love, but, or really more, and I would not leave you. I would not leave you is the I won't do that. So we go from Meat Loaf playing these teenagers who aren't into serious love commitments. They want to live in the moment, ride their motorcycles, have these glamorous, over the top, but not long-term mature relationships. Now he's singing this song where he's saying, no, I really want a love for all time. I'm this mature man. I want an adult love. Then we get track 2, which has one of these ridiculous Jim Steinman titles. It's Life is a Lemon and I Want My Money Back. It has a searing rock sound, perhaps too much of a searing rock thing. But what's great about Meatloaf is, on the one hand, a lot of these songs have a hard rock sound, so they're good for people who like that. But he also has a clear, crisp voice. So for people who want to listen to more singer-songwritery, vocal-centric music, it also works to that ear. It's the perfect combination. But what is the song is about? Well, our hero is no longer young. He didn't die a teenage martyr at the end of Bat Out of Hell. No, he's just gotten to grow and become cynical. And kind of like John Lennon on God, he eventually goes on to denounce all the things he once believed in. Some of these things were things he'd already denounced by Bat Out of Hell Part 1, like faith and the town he lives in. But he's also denouncing sex. It feels like nothing is going to save him. Life is just endlessly miserable and frustrating. Track 3, Rock and Roll Dreams Come Through, other than doing this weird, sometimes frustrating thing where it takes forever to get to the chorus. I also have this problem with the Journey song, Don't Stop Believing. But this is the first song and maybe only song that feels like it could have been on Bat 1, and Jim Steinman actually recorded it back in 1981 originally, because it's just a song about celebrating the magical power of rock and roll. And in the context of this album, Meatloaf, or the character, is disenchanted with his middle-aged life. He has to plead to keep his romantic relationship, and now he has to look back to the old god, and the old god is rock and roll. Track number 4 is It Just Won't Quit. This continues the discussion of disillusionment, but translates it a bit into these confounding nightmares, I guess going with the hellish imagery from the title and the cover. And then really taking that hellish imagery to the next level is the overtop, wonderfully titled next song, Out of the Frying Pan Into the Fire. So this is a showy kind of tune, and it makes a lot of references to heat. And it's really just about a passionate love. But because it has this sort of dire warning of the song of, oh no, you're in the frying pan and now you're jumping into the fire, I kind of interpret it as being about an affair. The singer is temporarily excited about this love, but somehow knows it's a bad idea. Then track number 6, Objects in the Rear View Mirror May Appear Closer Than They Are. The most ridiculous title of them all, and it forces some slightly clunky lyrics, but it really is a beautiful, meaningful song once you've heard the lighter Meatloaf stuff. So this feels like the character being in therapy, and they're singing a song that kind of sounds like Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, but what it's doing is taking that rock and roll car or motorcycle driving lover boy from Springsteen and from earlier Meatloaf songs and making it get dark and real. The song first deals with having a childhood friend die in a motorcycle crash. And perhaps the protagonist of Bat 2 was the friend of the guy who died at the beginning of Bat 1, if we want to see a story here. Then the second verse is about a violent alcoholic father, which was a problem that the real Meatloaf had. And I don't know if the other 2 verses also end up being about Meatloaf. And finally, the last verse is about being saved by a first relationship. And this is interesting because it felt like out of the frying pan into the fire was warning us that going into a certain kind of love is a bad idea, that this album is about celebrating the commitment of I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. But then we're going to talk about our next few songs. Track 7 is called Wasted Youth, and this is kind of confusing because track 8 also sings about wasted youth. Track 7 doesn't involve Meatloaf at all. It's Jim Steinman doing a monologue, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it's funny and it's rock and roll, and it's over the heart, over the top, and it involves a weird relationship with a father as well. So on the one hand, it has a weird light contrast with Objects in the Rearview Mirror, but almost what it does is it shows one way of dealing with the psychological problems in that last record. Yes, you could be somber and meditate on your pain, or you could go, F it, I'm going to be rebellious and take a stand against authority. So then we have track 8, Everything Louder, track 9, Good Girls Go to Heaven, Bad Girls Go Everywhere Else, and track 11, Lost Boys and Golden Girls. And these songs all seem to have a shared message that it's better to be bad than it is that it's better to be bad than it is to be aimless. So this was a record that felt like it was gonna, so on the one hand, you hear all these various songs and these last few feel kind of thematically similar, and it feels like the story doesn't have a complete arc. It starts out with the singer being sad and not doing well in middle-aged life, and then he decides to rebel and out of the frying pan into the fire. But I guess as the album's title goes, the singer does not go into hell and back. He just goes back into hell, but he learns to embrace that hell. So it might not feel like a complete story, but it's almost kind of a twist. Meat Loaf, I'm not sure exactly how it manifested in his later life, but he was raised quite Christian. Apparently, his grandmother raised him in what's called the Church of Christ. I don't know what that is because I thought they were all churches of Christ, but there's one called the Church of Christ. So one has to think he was quite conflicted in a lot of his music, not just because of the explicit sexual content, but the explicit hellish imagery and all this imagery about the true heaven and heaven can wait, you know, it really being about sex and rock and roll. Jim Steinman, the writer, I don't imagine he had those problems. He was of a Jewish background, and I don't imagine very religious. But if we hear Meat Loaf putting himself into the character in this album, maybe he's starting the record with a fear, I can't go into hell. And Jim Steinman, the writer, is coaxing him in. He's saying, it's okay. The conservative things that these right-wing churches are saying is not true, that it's okay to be rebellious. It's okay to have fun all your life. And, you know, maybe it's not okay to literally have affairs, but you shouldn't be afraid of this part of you. You have to lean into your symbolic hellhound and have a good time, just as you did in the days of Bat Out of Hell. So is this story as complete and haunting as Godfather Part II? No. But is this the Godfather Part II of albums? I think there's a very good case it is, because Bat Out of Hell Part 1 gave us some epic and goofy and absolutely rock and roll songs, and Bat Out of Hell 2, well, maybe not as fun on a first listen, shows how you can take those intense emotions, apply them to an older character, and take them to the next level. So great job, Jim Steinman. Great job, Meat Loaf. And again, with your deaths both being recent, both sorely missed. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.